My grandmother, Mabel Armstrong Gonzalez, was born on Christmas Day, 1895. She was married to Clyde Gonzalez on Christmas Day, 1915. She died on July the 4th, 1989. Life's significant dates for her were significant for all of us. Mama Mabel, as we called her, lived as a widow for almost 59 years. Her husband died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 38 in November of 1930 at their home in Fort Myers, Florida. Thankfully, she somehow managed to raise two daughters on her own. Our mother, who was 13 when her dad died, was their oldest daughter. In my humble opinion, she turned out just fine. Mama Mabel eventually moved to Georgia and spent the last 19 years of her life in Reynolds. She lived in a mobile home in my parents' backyard. We had a lot of conversations with her. Talk about old school. She was really old school. She did not have a television until she moved to Reynolds, and we insisted on it. She was an avid listener of the radio. For her, the word pregnant was a curse word. She claimed she never saw herself naked. When taking a bath, she claimed she never looked. When asked how her children got here, she said the lights were off. She ended up loving television, by the way, although she never liked naked. Her favorite show turned out to be Lawrence Welk. She would knock you down to get to the TV when that show came on. Her life in Reynolds brought about many changes, I suppose. She also ended up loving Reynolds and made friends with a lot of the ladies here. She also loved the Methodist Church, although she was a die-hard Presbyterian. I remember I was playing golf on July the 4th, 1989, when I got word that she had died. As her grandchild and the local undertaker, it became my responsibility to prepare her for burial, which would be next to her husband in her beloved Fort Myers. This became a story for the ages. Since she had lived in Reynolds for almost 2 decades, Mama wanted to have a funeral in Reynolds and a separate graveside service in Fort Myers. My customary course of action would have been to call a funeral home in Fort Myers to handle the interment, and I would handle the local funeral. But since it was my grandmother, I decided to save a little money and just handle it all. I knew legally I should have a funeral home with a Florida funeral license to handle the interment. But since I had never had anyone check my funeral license at a cemetery, I proceeded right ahead. Our plan was to stop somewhere along the road and spend the night. I had to be there early to take care of the business at hand. The rest of the family would come later and also spend the night on the way and get to Fort Myers in time for the graveside service the next day. Since Kathy drove a Chevy Astro van, I decided at the last minute for us to drive Mama Mabel in the van so we could take our time coming back and make a mini vacation out of it. The first problem was I had to move the driver's seat as close to the steering wheel as I could get it for the casket to fit in the van. My 6'5" frame was crammed behind the steering wheel as we took off for an 8 or 9 hour drive to Fort Myers. Take a moment and picture that. In addition to the casket in the back, we also had a van full of flowers. Another picture to envision. At some point on the journey, I stopped to get gas. As I was pumping the gas, I noticed the guy next to me who was pumping his gas kept glancing through the window in our van. He finally asked me, "Is that a casket?" I replied, "Yes, it's my grandmother." I was just answering his question, but I could tell from the expression on his face he was both astonished and confused. To help him, I added, "It is much cheaper this way." It was definitely cheaper, but now he was even more astonished. Later that evening, we stopped at a drive-through fast food place to get something to eat. At that point, our plan was to stay at a motel on that exit. I asked the lady at the fast food window how far we were from Fort Myers. She said we were less than 2 hours. We then decided to drive on to Fort Myers so we would not have to get up so early and drive the next morning. Mind you, we had no hotel reservations and a dead human body in the van with us, and our estimated time of arrival in Fort Myers would be somewhere after midnight. When we finally got to Fort Myers, I saw a motel and pulled in. The front lobby looked okay from the outside. Kathy stayed with Mama Mabel while I went in to see if they had a room. They did, and I checked us in. As we were driving around the motel to our room, the place looked really rough. I remember Kathy stating rather emphatically, "There's no way I am staying in this place." I agreed, but told her I had to use the restroom. And left Kathy in the van with Mama Mabel. My bathroom trip took longer than expected, and Kathy was getting worried. As I was opening the motel room door to come out, Kathy startled me as she had just walked up to the door. Her question was, "What in the world have you been doing?" I won't tell you what I told her. As we went back to get in the van to look for another place to stay, there was another significant development. Kathy had locked the keys in the van with the engine running. And yes, Mama Mabel was in it. We were now forced to go back in the room. I found a phone book and looked in the yellow pages for a locksmith. I called, and thankfully he answered. I found out quickly calling a locksmith to come to a cheap motel at 1 a.m. is anything but cheap. About an hour later, he showed up. I walked out with him. Kathy had decided we had no choice at that point but to spend the rest of the night in this room. It did not take him long. He opened the door. I turned the van off and took the keys. As I was paying him, cash only, he asked another interesting question. "Is that a casket in the van?" By then I was really tired and frustrated, so I gave him a tired and frustrated answer. "Yes, that's my girlfriend." About that time, Kathy opened the door of the motel room. The locksmith looked at her and then looked at me. He took the cash and left with no more questions. The next morning, I had to go downtown to pay for the opening and closing of the grave and the vault. I had planned all that ahead of time. What I did not plan or think about was Mama Mabel had to ride with me, along with all the wilting flowers. Kathy, on the other hand, who had almost zero sleep, was not ready. So I left Kathy in the dingy motel room while Mama Mabel and I drove to the courthouse. I went in to pay and to make sure the grave was being opened. When I came out to get in the van to go back to the motel, I looked across the street and noticed a sign on the building, Hanson Appraisal. Woody Hanson is my cousin, and I had not seen him in a long time. I decided to drive over across the street to see him. That visit took longer than I had planned. Woody was wearing a shirt and tie and told me he was planning on going to Aunt Mabel, as he called her, funeral. He walked me out to the parking lot when I finally left, and I saw another astonished look on her face. "Is this Aunt Mabel?" I tried to explain. In the meantime, back at the motel, Kathy was worried to death. She thought something had happened to me. When I got back, her worry turned to a bit of anger. By the way, this is way before cell phones and such. She had no way of getting in touch with me. I took Kathy and Mama Mabel to the Waffle House to eat. We parked the van so I could keep an eye on Mama Mabel while I enjoyed my cheese omelet. We left the Waffle House, and I decided to drive Mama Mabel one last time by her old home on Stella Street on the way to the cemetery. She had no way of telling us, but I always thought she appreciated that. When we got to the cemetery, I had another dilemma. I had to get the casket out of the van and on the lowering device, and there was nobody but Kathy and me to do it. I found some maintenance workers in the cemetery and asked them if they could help. There were only 3 of them, so I decided to back up closer to the grave while I was waiting on them, just to make it easier. All of a sudden, had backed into a concrete post. When my newly hired pallbearers got to the gravesite, the back door of the van would not open because of my little accident. Luckily, they were able to get a tool, somewhat like a crowbar type tool, to get it open. Other than that, the grave service went off without a hitch. One thing was for certain. After all that, there was no way I was going to leave that cemetery with Mama Mabel still in the van, even if I had to bury the van. Mama Mabel was very old school, but she had a great sense of humor. I have no doubt she would have laughed at this story. At least I sure hope so.